Greetings! And so the first week of class begins. And by now you should know that I am Gwen Zimmerman, your instructor for this course in selected topics in British literature. Now, my master's degree is dual in British literature and creative writing, and I explained in my welcome video why I centered on British literature as opposed to American literature or even world literature. There's something about the British Isles that calls to me, and I am of Celtic descent from Scotland via Ireland in Ulster, Ireland, and my ancestors were Roundheads in Ulster, Ireland. But this course isn't about me, and I'm not going into that any further than that. This week, we are going to start with two discussions, and one is going to be an introduction by you and talking about your experiences with British literature, and the other discussion will begin to explore the topics for the final paper. There is not a text per se to read in this first week, except you will be reading the preface for the class text and the module overview. And also you need to peruse the reading list for text that can be used for the final paper. And one student contacted me before class began asking if it is absolutely necessary to stick with those texts. And the rubric and the guidelines for the final project says yes, which I'm sure is going to disappoint some of you, but I do hope that you can find something on that list, two things on that list that do appeal to you. Now, in the module overview, it lists the different literary periods of British literature. And I guess that's kind of redundant, literary periods, literature, but I'm going to forge ahead here because I've started this video probably a half a dozen times and I'm not going to start it again. And it begins with the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, prior to the Anglo-Saxons, of course, there were indigenous peoples, because the Anglo-Saxons were not indigenous. There were indigenous peoples in the British Isles. There were the Picts. And the Celts, even though they really weren't truly indigenous, the Celts are very, very closely identified with Britain, even though at one time they covered all of Europe. And the Galatians in the Christian scriptures were Celts. Bet you didn't know that. And so we closely identify the Celts with Britain, and in particular, pre-Roman Britain. But Julius Caesar and his forces came in and beat down the Celts, and Hadrian built a wall between Scotland and England because he just couldn't seem to control those Scots, who, by the way, were Picts. And they are not considered literary periods. Now, the Celts did have runes, but they didn't use them to record history or their literature. And of course, Roman literature is something altogether. So we begin with the Anglo-Saxon period. And the Anglo-Saxon period is most often recognized as being started circa the 5th century of the Common Era by Hengist and Horsa, who were two brothers who were actually invited by the British King Vortigern to come down and help him fight the Picts. And they did. And they squashed the Picts, not the pigs, and then decided that they liked it there so much that they overthrew Vortigern and established the Anglo-Saxon Injute culture in Britain. Now, these tales are highly legendary, and the separation between fact and legend, and then even going into myth in some cases, as an example of Arthur, who came just a little bit after that, they are highly blurred. But it does seem that Hengist and Horsa did exist, and Vortigern, even though he is called by different names, also existed. But this establishment of Anglo-Saxon culture was established in England and lasted until 1066, when the Normans invaded England and basically destroyed the Anglo-Saxon language by insisting that everybody speak French. And for a long time after that, Anglo-Saxon was is still a foreign language, but people couldn't read it. Because one of the first things that a conquering nation often does is to outlaw the language of the culture that they subjugate. The British later did this to the Welsh, and they forbade the reading and writing of Welsh, but luckily for us, some Welsh people really dug in and continued to record their language, for which we should be thankful. But back to the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon language, even though we consider it Old English, is much more closely related to Old Norse than it is either Middle English or Modern English. And you can learn to read Anglo-Saxon in a few weeks with a dictionary. And I took a class in Anglo-Saxon as a graduate student and absolutely loved it. Now I don't know that I could really translate the language easily, but we still have many Anglo-Saxon words within our modern vocabulary. One thing that I loved about Anglo-Saxon literature was their vocabulary, because their writing, the metrical charms and the poetry, they did not like using the same words over and over again. And so the ocean becomes the whale road. And their poetry is just filled and infused with those types of phrases and words that they used in order to fit not only the metrics of the poems, but just to avoid repetition. So I'm looking at my notes here. This stuff I know, but I got to keep it in order so I don't get way too far off track. There is, if you're not familiar with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, it tells the history of the Anglo-Saxons, which again is very interesting. And there is a large corpus of Anglo-Saxon writing of which we were not even cognizant, and of which much was lost over the periods, even to the point where people would be writing over the vellum, the lambskin or calfskin books on which they recorded, and of course later societies also used to record their works. So unfortunately, much was lost. We gained some. There is only one extant manuscript of Beowulf, and it was not even translated until I think it was the 16th century. Don't quote me on that. 17th century. Don't quote me on that. I would have to review it, and I didn't. Mea culpa. Just think, Beowulf. We missed having Beowulf by this much, and what other works were lost? It makes me very sad to even think about it, so I'm not going to think about it. So I'm going to stop there, and I will also write some of this information below, so whether you hear it or whether you prefer to read, it's pretty much going to say the same thing. So do the reading, post on the discussions. Next week, we're going to start reading Beowulf and Gawain and the Green Knight, two of my favorites, and I'll talk more about Anglo-Saxon literature at that point. So I'm being quiet right now.